energy and air pollution will be one of the top 5 issues for the general election.
We talk about Putin being in control. He's not really. It's the various factions under him, and it suits them to have him at the front.
If you're trying to save for a house deposit and you'd have to save up some crazy amount of money, how on earth are you going to do that if a pint is £7?
There's certain key things that we want from India and there's certain key things that they want from us.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. You join us as we are still discovering things we hadn't noticed in yesterday's autumn statement. It's a bit like the day after the beach and you still find sand in your shoes.
Oh, I hate sand.
One of the policy announcements that we slipped in there to the autumn statement from the Chancellor was that defence spending is going to be just 2% of GDP at the end of the forecast in 2029. That's actually less than the government had previously said when it wanted to be 2.5%. Looks like that policy has been quietly scrapped. I wonder what former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace would have to say about that.
Yeah, that's actually a really big deal. And something else which was a headline grabber, which is that the Chancellor decided to freeze all alcohol duty right through to August next year. But if you remember at the beginning of August this year, the government quite quietly reformed alcohol duties. And while a couple of things saw tax cuts, a lot of things saw big increases. A bottle of wine rose by 20%, the duty on bottled wine by 20%. So in that context, yesterday's freeze is not really that generous.
Not that freezing at all.
No.
Oh dear. We've been speaking to plenty of political and business leaders for their reaction to yesterday's autumn statement. Here's the view, first of all, of Jim O'Neill, former chairman of Goldman Sachs and a former Treasury Minister who's also been an advisor to Rachel Reeves.
I'm trying to still get to grips with it. It's very much in that sense a budget for economic geeks and policy geeks to really think about. I heard the Chancellor himself reiterate this morning that the OBR had increased their estimate of trend growth because of the measures, especially the permanent move for investment tax allowances, which I indeed welcome given the UK's woeful investment performance. But actually, when you look at everything else that's going on at the same time as the OBR has to, they've actually slightly lowered, or appear to have slightly lowered, the trend growth rate to 1.6. And then, in addition, and part of the surprising headroom, I think, came from this 3% upward revision that the ONS, the statistics organisation, gave to the overall size of the UK a few months ago. So it was a sort of clever budget, very much aimed at trying to shore up the Tory factions, particularly the right, about the importance of tax cuts, aimed at an election anywhere from, 7 to 14 months into the future. But whether it's going to make a huge difference in the near term, I think is very questionable, because there are, of course, so many huge factors going on globally that affect the UK, especially on inflation performance, along with every other country. So I'm not sure. I'm still going to be thinking about it more the next few days. There were definitely some important supply-side things like the investment tax credits, but also the boost to the British Business Bank in terms of more growth venture investing, which obviously doesn't get much attention. But for the UK's role as a sort of start-up, scale-up place, I think that's an important thing to have happened as well.
Well, that's the view of former Treasury Minister Jim O'Neill. Well, let's bring in our senior UK economist Dan Hanson and our Money Distilled columnist John Stepek. Dan, talk to us about the economic outlook first. We've got slower growth predicted for next year and the medium term looking pretty anemic as well. What did you make of the forecast you heard from the OBR?
I looked at them and I thought they've sort of brought things into line with the consensus view. I think they were probably a little bit too optimistic in March about how quickly things would pick up, particularly next year. I think they had 1.8% growth for next year, which, where we're sat now at least, looks way too optimistic. I mean, I think for us at least, for next year they've got 0.7. That's still probably a little high from where I'm sitting, but nonetheless it feels more in the right range of what we might expect next year. Don't forget, we've still got this tightening, the impact of the tightening cycle still is coming through on the economy, so they need to sort of acknowledge that. Bigger picture, I think, and looking to the medium term, one interesting thing and the big thing that the reason why Hunt was able to announce these tax cuts is that the cash size of the economy is much, much bigger, and that's to do with the inflation story. It's to do with a view that inflation will be more persistent than they thought, the OBR thought in March. But the cash side of the economy is much bigger, and that obviously means significantly more receipts, and that's why Hunt had the money for the giveaway. So
higher inflation is useful for the government's finances in the
Yeah, so I mean, there's this tension, isn't there? And I think everyone's sort of picked up on it in the press and in various the sort of broader commentariat that you get with high inflation, you get more receipts, particularly if the inflation is domestically generated and particularly through wage growth. What it also means, though, is that spending plans look increasingly hard to deliver, because if you don't lift spending, and government's departments are under increasing pressure with their budgets because of rising prices, there's a huge question mark on whether the spending plans can ever be delivered. Now, Hunt's trying to square that circle by saying he can lift public sector productivity and things can be delivered for less money. But I think there's just a huge risk there that what he's done is spent the extra money from the revenues but not done anything to address the public spending squeeze that will come and face the next government.
John, I wonder, when you were listening to Jeremy Hunt yesterday, were you booking a holiday to the Maldives on the back of the 2 percentage point cut to national insurance?
Oh, absolutely. I was straight on there. Obviously, I'd have to go during rainy season, but whenever that is. I mean, look, 2 percentage points off NI at the level that he did is pretty good. I mean, people are going to notice. It'll be a small bump, but it's definitely better than a kick in the pants. And actually, to be fair, is probably in many ways more politically sensible than having cut income tax, for example, because with this you only target workers. So pensioners don't pay NI, but that means obviously they don't get an income tax cut at a time when obviously there are mixed feelings about pensioners in the wider country, because it always feels as if they're getting their state pension, for example, was boosted by the full
the triple lock stayed with us,
Yep. The triple lock was absolutely intact, and so although you'll get some people complain that more pensioners are being dragged into the tax net, but that is a side effect of them becoming wealthier, and it's actually probably a good sign. And so I actually thought the national insurance cut was a good idea. I mean, obviously it still means we're still getting absolutely leathered over the course of the prediction cycle.
Well, that's the question I want to ask you, actually. It's a slightly impossible question. If you can just take us back to the freezing of the personal allowances over the last few years, where do we sit in the round if you kind of bring together the big tax rises we've had over the past few years and the changes yesterday? I'm not asking the exact figure, but where are we?
It's a tricky one. I've seen lots of different estimates, but I've seen an estimate that he maybe handed back about a quarter of what he was going to take from a stealth tax point of view. And I'm glad I've got Dan's nod of approval there. And somebody else pointed out that now it's it represents something like a 4 pence increase on income tax basic rate over the whole period, which is up till 28, 29 now. So, I mean, I described it yesterday as a bit like seeing a guy pull away having nicked your card, and then he rolls down the window and throws your wallet out to you. So it's it's a little it's small blessings. But the other thing I would say, though, is that obviously the stealth taxes aren't visible. I mean, that's why they're called stealth taxes. And so for most people from January, they won't be thinking about, okay, well, over time, I'm getting dragged into a higher tax rate. They're just going to see, oh, look, I've got an extra 10, 20, 40 quid in my pay packet this month. And that will also perhaps go some way to helping with people who are coming off their fixed rate mortgages and things like that. So overall, it's quite clever politics.
This is quickly becoming a discussion about a vibe session, or whether or not that's actually going to be affected in how people think about these things. Dan, Jeremy Hunt said that they had 110 measures for growth in the autumn statement. Did you see anything in there that's going to make a marked difference to the UK's economic future?
So I think going back to the NI cut, there's definitely a risk that next year the economy does a little bit better because of that. I mean, I think the what I thought was interesting is that the OBR said it would boost demand in the economy, but also supply. So it would essentially incentivise workers to work longer hours, because obviously the return to that hour of work is greater because the post-tax real wages is higher. So I thought that was really interesting, and actually, we're in the process of looking at our forecast again, and I think we'll nudge it up maybe 0.1, 0.2 percentage point on the back of what he announced on NI. So there's a near-term demand effect, and obviously there's a question there about inflation as well, whether it was, that will be inflationary. Longer term, I think there are positive effects as well, particularly it's the capital expensing measure that was really the big one there for us. That was something that at least appears in the data to have done quite a lot, and its predecessor, the super deduction, it's done quite a lot for business investment. So I think that's really positive. All of that said, of course, and just sort of I think the important context here is the OBR did still, and you said this, Yuan, that they did still downgrade their medium-term outlook. So their trend growth assumptions fallen from 1.8% to 1.6%. So it wasn't enough for the OBR to stop the OBR doing that. Nonetheless, I think particularly the capital allowance will boost investment and therefore boost productivity in the longer term.
John, do you think there's an element here of trap setting? I mean, it wouldn't be the first time, would it? Do you think that the Tories are really just trying to sort of box Labour in here, because Labour have accepted the two big tax cuts, so that's making public spending even tighter, isn't it? And the projections of public spending over the next few years are incredibly tight, aren't they? And that's not something that Labour's going to like to take on. No, and I mean, it is tricky. I mean, I guess this problem is going to face any government that came in anyway, because obviously we spent a lot of money during COVID, and we spent an awful lot of money alleviating the pressure on households for the energy price kind of crisis. So that does need to be paid back somehow. Or rather, the public finances need to be maintained at a sustainable level. And everyone's now got a bee in their bonnet because of what happened to Liz Truss a year ago. We probably took the wrong lesson from that, because Britain's public finances, I mean, I don't know if Dan will agree with me on this or not, but relative to the rest of the G7, we're doing fine. It's
the general picture isn't great either, to be fair.
Well, no, you're right. It's not great, but the thing is, with sovereign debt, as long as you don't stand out as being the big spendthrift amongst, it's like, where's the money going to go? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
As long as relative to America, you don't look as if you're spending an awful lot more than them, then you're probably all right. So I think. As long as you're not the worst kid in the playground, you're not going to get bullied by
the bond vigilantes are not going to come along and give you a doing. So I think that there's actually probably more leeway whoever gets into power in terms of what they can and what they actually will do. I mean, really, the thing here is that Jeremy's got to pretend that he's keeping an eye on the books, but what he's actually doing is he's spending what he needs to ahead of the election. He's saying, don't worry, I'm going to make it all up after the next election. It's like, of course he's not. It's just that the OBR ticks his homework.
Yeah. Dan, I want to get you in on that point as well, because we're thinking, of course, about how this autumn statement sets up the next year, and this question of there being all these tax cuts, but then that's going to have to come from somewhere. We have this figure of £19 billion of cuts needed in government departments to kind of balance things out. What sort of fiscal situation does the government look like, whoever the government may be, let's say in a year's time, just by coincidence?
Oh, John's just said it there. It's very, very difficult. It's always austerity delayed, isn't it? So you get to the moment, you get to the in-year position, and your bias is always to loosen fiscal policy. It isn't to make the really tough decisions. Or if you do have to make those tough decisions, you put them into the back end of the forecast. And as John said, the OBR ticks your homework. So that's the way it'll sort of continue to go. And I think, quite frankly, spending is just going to be higher. There's no way they can deliver on this, because you have to remember the context in the UK is that we've been through 10 years of austerity between 2010 and 2019. We've got all these commitments on health spending, defence spending. So the departments that aren't protected they end up in a world where they just simply can't deliver what they're being asked to deliver, and the cuts just aren't feasible. So, going back to the question you asked previously, yes, and John's right, it's a global problem. I think the UK is just a bit more honest about it. The Truss experience has made people very, very cautious, Labour in particular, very, very cautious. But I think you have to remember it's two things. One is, as long as you're keeping the OBR on side and engaging with them, that's a very important bit of the picture. The other thing is investment spending, which is the thing that Labour really want to do, and that's the sort of difference between Labour and the Tories. Jeremy Hunt stood up yesterday and did £26 billion worth of tax cuts, and then slayed Labour for saying that they were going to spend £28 billion. It's the same thing for the public finances. actually, if if you're in markets and you're looking at those two different policy choices, maybe you'd say investment is probably better long term for the UK economy in terms of the UK's long term prospects. But that would be my take anyway. So what matters is the type of fiscal stimulus that takes place as well in terms of how it's interpreted. But I think, look, take a year from now, to answer your question, Stephen, the government's going to inherit a very, very difficult fiscal position. And if it is Labour, there's going to be a lot of blaming for the reasons why they can't deliver the packages and the policies that they'd like.
Yeah, I noticed a little quip about the OBR at the beginning of Hunt's speech. I think a slight swipe at Liz Truss a year ago. Dan and John, thanks so much for giving us your thoughts 24 hours after the budget. That's a budget. Awesome statement, mustn't call it a budget. Senior UK economist Dan Hanson and our Money Distilled columnist John Stepek.
Now, Labour says the Chancellor was picking the pockets of working people in the autumn statement. Here's some of the response from Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves.
This would have to be seen in that context, but in the end, how do you know whether you're better off? It's your bank balance. And this will be the first Parliament ever where real disposable incomes are going to be lower at the end of it than they were at the beginning.
So Rachel Reeves says that Labour's plan will boost the economy, get debt falling and make working people better off. So how are they planning to do all of these things? Let's speak now to one of the most influential voices in the Labour policy machine. Joining us is Josh Simons, director of the think tank Labour Together. Josh, welcome to Bloomberg. Is that a fair introduction, by the way? How much are you influencing policy of the Labour Party?
Well, we're a funny thing because we're a political think tank and we're open about wanting Labour to win and to govern. And that means that one of the things we do is bring together electoral strategy and thinking about arguments and narratives with policy and ideas. And I think that makes us quite different to most of the other charitable think tanks out there in the UK.
Now, Josh, Labour has welcomed the two big tax cuts of the Chancellor's statement, the national insurance cut and making permanent the full expensing. What would Labour do differently given the fiscal constraints?
Well, as you will expect me to say, we are Labour Together, not the Labour Party. And so Labour's decision-making about tax and spend is for Labour rather than me as director of Labour Together.
I'm sure you have some ideas, though.
I have a few ideas. And the important big picture point is it would be crazy for Labour to be making specific tax rise, tax cut, spend decisions at this point in the cycle. Liz Truss gave us a great case study in what happens when you make announcements about tax cuts before you're actually ready to figure out how to fund them. Gilt markets think that you're slightly unhinged and punish you. And I think it's very wise of the Labour Party to be quite careful about making specific tax and spend commitments at this point in the cycle.
Well, then when you're thinking about policy and trying to develop that, surely you take the constraints of what the economic situation is and the fiscal situation is into account. So I wonder, how does the announcements that we heard yesterday from the Chancellor factor into what you're suggesting as being best practice for a future Labour government?
Well, the big picture of what the Chancellor said yesterday is that after 13 years of Conservative governments, we're in a really, really difficult position. And both Keir and Rachel have been really clear about that and have actually levelled with voters and said, is it really the case that after a year or two of a Labour government, you're going to feel radically different? Let's not expect that and let's not promise it. Let's talk about the medium term and the long term. And I think in some ways this has been kind of undersold as a part of the argument that Keir and Rachel are developing. Missions are not just about how government spends money. They're much, much bigger than that. They're about how the government works with the private sector. They're about how the government works with the third sector. And they're supposed to be kind of national missions. And the reason why that's so important is that what argument Labour makes about crowding in private investment at the next election is a really important dividing line between Labour and the Conservatives that, won't deliver immediate payoffs by the end of year one, but will be an important difference in what Britain feels like as a place to live in by the end of the first Parliament.
But surely what we do with public spending is vitally important to Labour. Labour's been saying for the last 13 years we're not spending enough on the NHS, we're not spending enough on schools, we're not spending enough on the police. So getting that right is vital, isn't it? Do you feel there's something of a trap being laid here by Jeremy Hunt? You remember before the 2010 election, a lot of Tories felt that Gordon Brown left a trap for them by jacking up the top rate of tax, which is something the Tories then wanted to reverse, but was unpopular. Do you think the Tories are sort of boxing Labour into a corner here with taxation and public spending?
Well, there's no doubt that the Conservatives are thinking about what happens if they lose the next election and what they would be leaving a Labour Party that won the next election. Now, there are obviously enormous challenges that Labour will face if it were to win the next election, but let's just step back for a moment and think about what that actually means, which is that having been, 15, 16 points behind in the polls 2 years ago, the Conservative Party look like the party now that think they're going to lose the next election, which is a pretty extraordinary thing. So it's important to remember that. But I also think that Labour have been really clear, and should be really clear, that the tax cuts that we saw yesterday are paid for by completely implausible assumptions about departmental spending after the next election. So I fully accept that these tax cuts that we've seen announced yesterday are in a sense a hoax. They're not real because they depend on these, ridiculous spending assumptions after the next election.
Well, except they are real because they're coming into place, aren't they? And Labour's also accepted them. So whether they're based on realistic assumptions or not, Labour is going along with them.
Labour's accepted that putting money back in the pockets of working people after 3 years in which money has been taken out of the pockets of working people is a good thing. It would be mad for Labour not to accept that principle. What Labour haven't said is made any specific commitments about which tax cuts would be reversed, which public spending cuts would be reversed, and you're going to get bored of me saying this, but it is a very wise thing not to make those specific commitments before we've had the final budget and before we know what the fiscal position looks like. But they have accepted the principle, the crucial principle, that money should be going back into the pockets of working people instead of being taken out of it, which is what the freeze on income tax thresholds has been doing now for 3 years.
Yeah, of course, the difficulty of doing that, though, is how do you continue to pay for the public services that we already have without making any improvements to them, while putting money, in your words, back into the pockets of working people? I can only imagine, and you speak, of course, a lot to people who are writing policy for the Labour Party, that there was somebody with a big whiteboard yesterday just crossing things out as they were looking at the OBR forecast, because the situation is going to be that much more difficult. So I want to get a sense of, do you get a sense that within the Labour Party there is a triage going on of people saying, well, we're not going to be able to do that, or we're not going to be able to do this because the situation simply won't allow for it?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer to that question is there's always a triage going on about what Britain can afford to do. That's what it means to govern our economy responsibly, and that's part of what Rachel has made the absolute centrepiece of the economic argument that she will take to the public, is that stability, predictability, certainty, doing what you say you're going to do is an absolutely vital part of the kind of economic governance that this country has been lacking. And part of that means, when looking at income, to make sure that the policies you're committing to can in fact be paid for. And
does that win elections, though? Does a message of stability, is that enough for people?
I think that there is no doubt that at the moment, millions of people across this country, I mean, we did a survey about 2 months ago where we looked at how many respondents could afford to pay an unexpected £300 bill, and a shocking number could not afford to pay a £300 unexpected bill. And what those families are living in at the moment is the constant experience of insecurity. They are terrified about what might come around the corner because they don't feel resilient in a good enough financial position in their household, and frankly as a country, to withstand whatever shocks might come. And what those people want is stability, security, the capacity to look 2-3 weeks ahead, to go out for a few pints and enjoy them without having to worry about how to pay for them. So I think there is an absolute hunger for stability, security, and I think that the public understand that a Conservative Party that at this point is so riven by internal political divisions cannot deliver that stable economic governance.
Once you've got stability, sorry to get back onto public spending again, but surely Labour's really only left with 3 options if you want to spend more money on public services. You have to scrap the tax cuts, you have to raise other taxes, or you need to change the rules and borrow more.
Well, as Labour have been really clear, every single thing we do will be done according to the fiscal rules that Rachel has set out. So the third of those, at least, is ruled out by those fiscal rules. I mean, the big question for Labour over the course of the next Parliament is how quickly can we get the economy growing again? And how quickly can we make sure that the economic growth we deliver through greater stability, through investment in Britain, and through these long-term plans that Rachel and Keir have set out, how quickly can that deliver for working people? You know, that's the great political question of the next Parliament. How in the first budget Rachel will make difficult choices about tax and spending in order to deliver that outcome is a question for Labour once they know the fiscal position, if we win the next election. But that broad ambition is clear, and the broad challenge that Labour will face is also really clear. And it's a challenge, you know, I would note that Biden is right in the middle of right now in the United States, where he's, you know, passed 3 major pieces of legislation, and the question of whether the pockets of the voters who put their trust in him will feel that is an open question.
Of course, very, very different pockets, and one could argue very different trousers as well, being worn by the United States. Josh Simon, Director of Labour Together, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. That is it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. Give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo, and our audio engineer was Maruful Hussain. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.